Hello and welcome to IP Study video lectures. Today we are going to discuss chapter number 7 of grade 6 social science. The chapter name is Cultural Roots of India. So as we read in our previous chapter, the cultural roots of India can be traced back to the Indus-Saraswati civilization. The people of Indus-Saraswati civilization may not be very religious, but we see many evidence that there were different deities that they worshipped. Mother Goddess, the god on the Pashupati seal, were perhaps some of the deities that people used to worship. With time we see that different kind of schools of thoughts emerged in the Indian society. And much of this can be credited to the arrival of Aryans. Now the Aryans came to India around 1500 BCE, which means approximately 3500 years ago from now. Right? 3500 years ago. Now, as agriculture developed in the region, we see that more and more advancements also came in the social, economic and political life. Different schools of thought emerged in the society, and we see with time India's philosophy became more and more diverse. Now let's study who were the Aryans. Now many believe that Aryans traveled to India from Central Asia. So they were Central Asian tribe that came to India. And they settled around the region of Punjab, and because they were from outside and they settled to India, this is why they are known as Indo-Aryans. Now where did they settle? In the beginning they settled around the region of Punjab. This region they called as Brahmavarta. Brahmavarta means land of the Brahmins. But sooner we see that they even traveled to other parts of India, mostly North India only. So this land from Himalaya to the Vindhyas, this land they called as the Aryavarta, or the land of Aryans. So we see slowly and gradually they moved to different parts of North India. Now Aryans are credited to write the Vedas. If we see, the start of India's philosophy or spirituality starts with the Vedas. Now there are 4 Vedas that were written. The first is Rig Veda, perhaps the most important Veda as well. Now this was written about 3500 years ago or 1500 BCE. It includes a lot of hymns on how to pray to different gods. And when we talk about the gods at that point of time, most of them were natural forces, gods like Indra, Varuna and so on. Then there was Sam Veda. Sam Veda included music and different chants. Then there was Yajur Veda, which included how to perform different kind of rituals. And lastly, there was Athar Veda, which included spell, charms for everyday life, how you can take care of your health and pray for these things. So all these prayers were included in the Athar Veda. Now this Vedic period can be broadly divided into 2 main periods. First one is early Vedic period and the other is later Vedic period. So now we will discuss about them. Now the early Vedic period is the time period when Rig Veda was written, and this is why this is also known as Rig Vedic period, right? Now what was the speciality of this time period? Now if we look at Rig Veda, it includes thousands of hymns. These are written in the Vedic Sanskrit language, and these prayers are mostly for cattle, children, especially sons and horses. Now this is very important. What you are praying for? You are praying for cattle. So it means cattle held a lot of importance during this time period. Cattle must be used for not only milk production but also in the fields. And then you used to pray for sons. Why? Because it shows there was some kind of patriarchy where sons were preferred more than daughters. Then there was they prayed for horses. Now this shows that battles were very important. You require horses while fighting battles. So many battles were fought during the early Vedic period, and these battles were fought to acquire more land and to acquire more cattle. So it shows that these things were valuable to the people. Now there were not definite armies during this time period, right? Every able man used to fight these battles, and you can say by acquiring more land and cattle, you were acquiring more wealth, and this wealth was used to fight even more battles and also to perform different yajnas, right? So we can see the people of this time period were very spiritual as well. They used to perform many different yajnas. So the the accumulated wealth was used for that purpose. Now let's talk about the political life of this time period. If we talk about the political life, we see that it was a tribal society, and these tribes were known as Jana or Vish. And the area where one particular Jana used to operate, you can say, was known as a Janpada. Right? And the head of this Janapada was known as Raja or Rajan. Now we see that this Raja or Rajan was not normally an hereditary position, right? Like in later Vedic period, and we see around many kingdoms in the world, the son of the king becomes the king. That was not the case in the early Vedic period, where it was mostly the most you can say powerful person who used to become the Raja. So it was kind of on the basis of merit and not just the king's son becoming the king. Right, so the duty of this Raja was to protect the people from enemies. So as you can see, many battles were fought for land and cattle. So the duty of the Raja, the dharma of the Raja, was to protect his subjects or protect his people from the enemies. Now let's talk about the division of the society. Here we see that the Varna system was established by the Aryans, where on the basis of occupation, we see that 4 different caste groups were formed. These were Brahmins, these were Kshatriyas, Vaishyas and Shudras. So Brahmins generally used to involve themselves in prayers, in teaching, in attaining more knowledge, whereas the Kshatriyas were the warriors whose job was to protect the kingdom, and then the Vaishyas were the businessmen, and the Shudras included all the peasants and artisans, laborers and servants. So they were known as dasas and dasyas, and their job was to serve the other 3 caste groups. Now when the Varna system was established, it was quite fluid. It means if a person belonging to a Vaishya or Shudra, if that person attains knowledge, that person can also become a Brahmin, right? But later on we see that this Varna system became more rigid. We will discuss more about that in the later part of the chapter. But here the Varna system was quite fluid in the sense that if you attain knowledge, you can be a part of another Varna group. Okay, now talking about the food, we see that rice, wheat and barley was grown at this point of time. We also have evidence of various milk products, vegetables, fruits. So these things are part of our dietary system as well even today. So all of that was consumed. Meat was only eaten on special occasions, right? Because meat is difficult to even digest and even to cook. So meat was consumed only on special occasions. And Soma and Sura were the popular drinks of that time period. Now let's talk about the ornaments and dresses of this time period. Here we see that most of these clothes were made from cotton and wool, as we can see that both can be found in the Indian subcontinent. The men used to wear something like a modern day dhoti with a shawl. And talking about women, they used to wear 3 kinds of garments. One was vassas, which was the lower garment, and then the athivassa, which was the upper garment. And then they also used to wear something called a nevi, which was kind of a cloth worn around their waist, so kind of like a modern day belt. Now both men and women used to wear ornaments like bangles, like necklaces and so on. Talking about the deities that were worshipped during this time period, we see that most of these deities were actually the natural forces. So Indra, Varuna, Indra, Varna, Agni were some of the gods. We also see some female deities that were worshipped like Aditi and Usha. We can see that people used to recite many prayers and also perform different sacrifices. Bali was performed in honor of these deities, and these prayers used to happen in open grounds, and there was no concept of temples like it is today, right? So these were done in open grounds. And Rig Veda, if we look at Rig Veda, it has a lot of hymns which were there to how you have to worship to these gods and goddesses. Now let us move to the later Vedic period. This time period spans from about 1000 BCE to 600 BCE. Now we see that the epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, which many of you would be familiar with, they were written around this time period, and that is why this is known as epic age. But not only these two epics, but we also see the three Vedas. Apart from the Rig Veda, all the other three Vedas, the Upanishads, the Brahmanas, and many other forms of, you can say, literature was written during this time period, which is why this time period is known as later Vedic period. So we can say that the later Vedic period is known for a lot of development in terms of spiritual and religious writings. Now, the Ramayana, as we discussed, was written during this time period by Valmiki, and Mahabharata was written by Ved Vyas. Bhagavad Gita is part of the Mahabharata. We also see a lot of development in terms of pottery. Painted grey ware, black and red ware was some kind of pottery that was made by the people during this time period. So we can see even from the artistic point of view, there were many developments during this time period. Now, talking about the political life of the later Vedic period, we see that the position of the king became more important, and the position of the king also became hereditary. So earlier we could see that it was not necessary that the next Raja would be the son of the previous king, but in the later Vedic period, this position became more hereditary in nature. And the people who were associated with the king, positions like Senapati, they also gained importance in the society. The battles were still fought. These battles were fought not for cattle, but mainly for land. We can also see that the position of women in the society had less importance. So the society became more patriarchal in nature, and the sabhas, which were part of, you can say, an important part of the early Vedic period, they also had less importance. In fact, it was the Brahmin class which enjoyed more power. Now, talking about the social life of the people in this later Vedic time period, we see that ashrama system became very important. Now, what was this system? It basically divided the life of a human being into 4 stages, right? And this holds a great truth even in the modern day life. So the first stage is brahmacharya, or the student life, where the person is supposed to study and get the knowledge of the world. Then it is the grihastha life, or the family life, where the person is getting married, maybe holding a family. So the person is spending his life in the, you can say, as a household person, taking care of the entire house. Then after this, the person has to spend the vanaprastha life, which means life of a hermit, a wanderer. So the person is trying to seek truth, try to find the meaning of life, and that is why that person is moving from one place to another in search of the truth. And finally, the sannyasa stage, which involves total renunciation of the world. So now the person has no, you can say, ties. There is no concept of maya. Maya means attachment. So no concept of attachment in the heart of a sannyasi. That person has completely renunciated from the world and is waiting for his moksha, or you can say for salvation. Now, talking about the dress and ornaments of this time period, we again see that cotton, wool and even silk was worn by the people during this time period. And Silver ornaments also became popular. So this is kind of a change from the early Vedic period where we saw mostly woolen and cotton clothes were worn. Here silk was also worn by the people and silver ornaments were also becoming popular. Talking about the economic life of the people, there was one drastic change that was brought with the use of iron. Now, iron is stronger metal than compared to copper or the stone tools which were used previously. So, because of this, we can see that agriculture became better and even tool making became better because of the use of iron tools. Mixed farming was practiced by the people because of this reason, where they could grow more than one crop, something which is practiced even today. Then we also see in terms of economic change that apart from the bali was the sacrifices that were sacrifices of animals, which was a voluntary kind of tax which was given to the king. But here some other minor taxes also came into existence. And why did this happen? Because earlier we studied that the position of the king in the later Vedic period became more important. So as the king and his officials, his Senapati and other administrators became more important or more powerful, then new kind of taxes were also collected from people. Now let's move to the next topic. This topic is Upanishads. So Upanishads is another important kind of literature, scripture that is found in the later Vedic period, and it holds great importance in the spiritual and philosophical journey of ancient India. If we can see the birth of philosophy, we can say India has been credited as a place where early roots of philosophy was found, right? And Upanishads hold great importance in that regard. Now, what exactly are the Upanishads? So, these are believed to be written by rishis or the sages after very deep thinking, and they try to answer a lot of questions that come in the life of a person. See, if you look at philosophy is all about asking questions about our existence, who I am and what is my purpose in life. So these questions are tried, you can say the answers to these questions are somewhat there in the Upanishads, right? So these questions about the mysteries of life, about the universe and the soul, they are tried to be answered in the Upanishads. Now when we talk about the literal meaning of Upanishad, it means sitting near your guru. So if we see Upa means near, Ni means down, and Shad means to sit. So if we look at the nature of Upanishad, it is the conversations between the teachers and the students, the guru and the shishyas, right? So in this way, they have tried to answer so many different questions. Now the Upanishads are written somewhere around 1000 to 600 CE, right? So in this time period of later Vedic period, we can see that Upanishads were composed. Now the teaching of the Upanishads has become a important part of the Indian philosophy as well, right? Many people, if you talk to them, they also believe in some of the things that are written in the Upanishads. So what are these things? So according to the Upanishads, a person could reach God through bhakti, right? Bhakti or personal devotion. And yes, before that, another important teaching is that the human body has a soul which is known as Atma, which cannot be destroyed. So many people believe in the concept of a soul, and this soul they believe is different from the human body. So this soul actually moves from one body to another, and it cannot be destroyed. That is the belief of many people, right? So it also, if we just reflect on this idea, it also brings upon the idea of reincarnation, because if the soul cannot be destroyed, then maybe the soul moves from one human body to another, right? Now, another important teaching of Upanishad is that we can reach God without the help of the priest and without the help of different rituals and sacrifices. So, Upanishad was not in the favor of the different sacrifices, the different rituals that were recommended by the Vedas, right? So, they talked about not performing these rituals. Now, Upanishad also believed in the law of karma, law of karma simply means that if we do bad deeds to someone, somebody will do bad deeds to us, right? And if we do good, we will get good. So that simple concept is the law of karma. It also talks about the past actions. So it's not maybe the current life, but even your past lives. If you have done something bad in the past life, then you will not have a happy life in the current one. Right. Now, Upanishad also talks about the practice of yoga and meditation for a healthy life. So these are some of the beliefs of the Upanishads that are still, we can say, relevant in the Indian philosophy today. Now, Upanishads, if we talk about them, there are 108 in total. 11 of them are considered as the Maha Upanishads or the main Upanishads. Some of the early Upanishads include the Chandogya and Kena, and the later Upanishads include the Isa and the Katha. Right? So there are different Upanishads, and we just don't need to go in detail of them, but we understand how they talk. They're a very important source of from where we get the Indian philosophy. We talked about yoga earlier. Yoga is talked about in the Upanishads as well, and now yoga is not only for our physical fitness but also our mental fitness, right? So it developed in India around the first millennium BCE, right? So we see that the focus of yoga is not only the health benefits but also our spiritual growth. Now, in the later Vedic period, we see that there were some changes that were happening. Caste system between 800 to 600 BCE, we see that this caste system became very rigid, right? Earlier we see that in the early Vedic period, we see that there was Varna system which was kind of fluid. Anyone could, be part of any caste group. But here we see it became more rigid. And this is why we see that the Brahmins and even Kshatriyas, they gained more importance as compared to the other two caste groups. So they were the dominant caste groups in the society. And to counter this, we see that different belief systems came forward in the Indian society. Two of them were led by Gautam Buddha and Mahavira. Now, Gautam Buddha and Mahavira, we will study about them in detail. They are considered as the founders of Buddhism and Jainism, two religious belief systems which have originated in India, right? So we will study about them. So first of all, Buddhism. Alright, so let us study about Buddhism in detail. Siddhartha Gautama is considered as the founder of Buddhism. He was born in Lumbini to Sudhodana and Mayadevi. Mayadevi passed away during the process of childbirth. They belong to the Sakya clan. So we can see that Gautama lived a life of a prince. So it was a very, you can say, lavish life, a royal life that he lived. But it is believed that Sudhodana, his father, was told by someone that your son will become a monk in his adult life. And no king wants his son to become a monk, right? You can enjoy all the powers as a prince, as a king. So he did not want him to live a life of a monk. But what happens is that he protects his child throughout his life. He does not make him see the miseries of the world, and even gets him married to Yashodhara, and he also has a son named Rahul. But when Siddhartha Gautama turns 29, he sees four things. First of all, he sees an old man, then a deceased man, a corpse, and an ascetic, which means a sadhu. So when Gautama sees these four sides, he has a lot of questions about life. He becomes very anxious and wants to find so many answers. And he leaves his home at this age. So Gautama left his home at the age of 29, and for 7 years he kept on wandering. He wanted to find all these answers, and finally at the age of about 35 he attained enlightenment. It was under under a Bodhi tree that he attained this enlightenment. We can see that this particular tree and this particular place, Bodh Gaya, is still very sacred in the hearts of the followers of Buddhism. So after he attained this enlightenment, he was called as the Buddha, which means the enlightened one. Now the rest of his life, for about 40 plus years, he kept on moving from one place to another, giving summons to people to teach them about what he had found about the meaning of life. And what was this? What was the main teachings of Lord Buddha? It can be summed up in these 4 noble truths. So what are these? First is that suffering is an integral part of our lives, right? So there is a lot of sufferings in our lives. And why is this suffering? That is the second noble truth. It is caused by our desires. Now, we all want something in our life, but this quench for more and more makes us feel anxious about our life. It makes us suffer, right? That is what Buddha has taught us. Then this suffering ends when our desires ends, right? So if you want to end your sufferings, you need to really kill your desires, these desires which keep on asking you to achieve more and more. There is a greed. It is not a need. Yes, you should achieve more in your life, but it should not be to the point where constantly you want more and more from life. And then the freedom from suffering can come from following the eightfold path. So now he also gave us a solution through this eightfold path, how we can curb our desires to live a meaningful life. And what is this eightfold path? It includes lessons like right view. So we should have a nice perspective towards life. Then right aspiration. What we want from life should also be a good thing. So we all have targets in our life. We want to achieve this or that, but it should be right aspiration. Our aspiration should be to grow and not to, you can say, make another person suffer because of our actions. Then he talks about right speech, very important. The kind of words that we use for other people, it should be right. Then right action. So our action should be again for growth of our own and growth of people around us, and not to harm another person. Then right livelihood. The way you earn your income should also be in a righteous manner. Right effort, so making the right kind of efforts for other human beings. Right mindfulness. Mindfulness means living in the moment, right? We should not, when we are doing some kind of a task, we should not be thinking about 10 different things. If we do that, we will never be happy, we will never be satisfied. And lastly, right concentration. So to do all the other things, to have right speech, right vision, right aspiration, right action, right effort, you need right kind of concentration, where you are able to meditate, where you are able to control your mind. So all those things are required to live a good life. Now let's talk about the Sanghas. Sanghas were the religious orders which were established by the Buddha, and his followers continued to follow these orders. Now what was this exactly? Those who became the part of these Sanghas used to live a life of a monk, you can say. They were known as bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. So basically they used to beg for food going to different villages and cities. Why did they used to do this? They used to do this so that their ego could be killed, right? And they could accept some humility. Now these Sanghas were not only present in India, but we can see that these Sanghas were present in different parts of Asia as well. Whether it is Central Asia, China, Tibet, Southeast Asia, we can see that they were present there as well. Now after the passing away of Buddha, we also see a split in Buddhism. Now what was this split was about? It was about the different belief systems. So there was Hinayana Buddhism, which followed the original teachings of Buddha. It emphasized individual salvation through self-discipline and meditation, just as Buddha had preached. But another sect of Buddhism also came into existence, which was the Mahayana Buddhism, which believed in the heavenliness of Buddha and believed in idol worship. So if you look at the original teachings of Buddha, it was against idol worship, and Buddha never claimed himself as a god, right? But Mahayana Buddhists, those who believe in Mahayana Buddhism, believed in the heavenliness of Buddha, which means they used to consider Buddha as someone like a divine figure for them. We have a lot of Buddhist texts and religious scriptures that are written. Now, the most famous of this is the Tripitaka, which is considered as the earliest collection of Buddhist teachings. Now, this name Tripitaka means three baskets. The original version, if we see, was woven together on leaves. It was written on leaves, woven together and put into baskets, and that is why this name Tripitaka comes into existence. Now, Buddhism spread to many different parts of Asia, as we discussed earlier. Two important rulers played a great role in this. One was Ashoka and another was Kanishka. Right? So we see that the role of these two leaders in spreading the message of Buddha to different parts of the world was very much there. They sent their own messengers to spread the idea of Buddhism to these regions like Tibet, China, Central Asia, Southern Asia, and Kanishka even spread it to Afghanistan. And that is why today we see that Buddhism is not only practiced only in India but also significantly in these regions as well. Now let's talk about the Jataka tales. Now Jataka tales is another important part of the literature, Buddhist literature. These are stories involving the previous lives of Buddha. If you can see, many stories that we have heard as part of our childhood have been inspired by the Jataka tales, where some kind of moral lesson is there in each of these stories. So mostly it is through animal characters. So the previous lives of Buddha are considered for Buddha to take form of different animal lives. So these stories help us understand about different values that are important in our life, right? So different moral lessons are given here. Now let's talk about another important school of thought that came into Indian philosophy during the 6th century BCE. Now this was Jainism. Now Jainism, the founder of Jainism is considered as the Vardhamana, who is also known as a Mahavira among his followers. Now Vardhamana Mahavira was born around 540 BCE to Siddhartha, who was the chief of the Janatrika clan, and his mother was Trishala, a Lichavi princess. So again we can see a very royal family, just like the case of Siddhartha Gautam. He was also born in a royal family. Mahavira was also born in such a family. He also got married to Yashoda, and he also had a daughter named Priyadarshana. If we talk about some of the core teachings of Jainism, teachings like not to kill, not to lie, not to cheat, and not to own property, these teachings were given by Lord Parshivanath, who lived about 250 years ago before Lord Mahavira. Now, if we talk about Mahavira, his life was similar to that of Gautam Buddha. Just like Buddha, he lived a very settled life, but at the age of 30, he also felt that he wanted to know more things about life. He became an ascetic at the age of 30. So he left his home, and to gain knowledge, he wandered for about 12 years. And after the age of 42, he attained enlightenment, and similarly, he taught his followers about how they can live a better life. Now, under Jainism, we can see there are two groups. These groups are Digambara. Now, these are the people who wear no clothes, whereas there is also Shvetambara, who wear white clothes. Now, let's focus about the teachings of Mahavira. There are three important teachings. These are right faith, right knowledge, and right conduct. Conduct means your behavior. So he focused on these three things to live a good life. Now Mahavira was not very critical about the Varna system, as was the case with Buddha. Buddha rejected the caste system, but Mahavira was not very critical of it. According to him, individual's position in his life was due to the good and the bad deeds of the previous life. So we can say Jainism also believes in the concept of karma, that whatever good is happening to you or bad is happening to you is because of your deeds of the previous lives. Now, Jainism believes in living a very simple life, and through living this simple life, you can free yourself from the cycle of birth and death and get moksha. So, getting moksha is the fundamental principle, or you can say the end goal of your life, that you have to free yourself from the cycle of birth and death. Now, he also supported the ideas of non-violence and kindness. If we see that even Jains that live today in India, about 50 lakh of our population, they are mostly vegetarians, so they do not believe in killing any human beings for their food consumption. Also on virtues like honesty, not to steal, being truthful, these were considered as some of the important teachings of Jainism. Now, Jainism was also against religious rituals and sacrifices. So this is common in Buddhism and Jainism, that they both do not support the various rituals that were present in the, we can say, later Vedic society. Mostly the spread of the teachings of Jainism was through the oral traditions, and only later on was it written down. During his time, Mahavira used to preach in the Prakrit language, which was the local language of the people, and not in Sanskrit. Why? Because Sanskrit was known to only the learned men, mainly the Brahmin class, but most of the people used to communicate in Prakrit. That is why when Mahavira used to summon people, he used Prakrit. Now let's talk about the concept of viharas, which are common in Jain and both Jainism and Buddhism. So in both Jainism and Buddhism, we see that the monks used to travel from one place to another. And while they were traveling, they needed to rest in some places. Now, especially during rainy seasons. So there were temporary shelters that were built for these monks. But as the number of monks increased and the weather conditions were even worse, so these temporary shelters were not very useful, and that is why we see that at places permanent shelters were being built. Now these permanent shelters came to be known as monasteries, and these monasteries became very important places of learning. Why? Because different travelers, different monks used to come and rest in these places. And when they rested here, there was a lot of spiritual exchange between these people. Even the merchants of that time used to support the construction of these viharas, these monasteries. Right, so land was given by the rich merchants, landowners, and even the kings for the construction of these monasteries. And even the common people used to support these bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. Why? Because in exchange of food, clothing, and medicines, they used to give them valuable life lessons. Right? These monks used to teach them about life and made them spiritual. Now let us move to the next topic of the chapter: folk and tribal roots. Now when we talk about the word folk means the beliefs, traditions, customs and practices of a specific group of people. And normally these traditions, these customs are passed down from one generation to another in oral form, in oral traditions. Why this is not written down? Because the culture of writing, especially if we look at the Indian society, in the ancient Indian society, the culture of writing was more with the kings, with the ruling class. So if we look at the ruling class, they used to write manuscripts, and inscriptions were written where information can be found. Whereas if we talk about the common people, they used to pass down their knowledge through different folklores, folk music and folk dance. right? So it is not penned down, it is only in these art forms that we can see their culture being passed down from one generation to another. Now let's discuss another term, that is tribe. A tribe is a close-knit community of people who have a common ancestry, culture, language and traditions. So a tribe is a similar kind of people who are living together. If we look at the ancient Indian society, since the time early humans have started to live, they have lived in tribes, they have lived in groups. Now most of the tribal groups in the world are located in geographical areas like forests, hills and other remote areas. And that is why we see that the tribal groups distance themselves from the mainstream society. They do not get the access to the mainstream society. So if in the folk culture of India we find similar kind of traditions, we will find something very dissimilar in the tribal society, where we can see that they have their own rituals, their own languages, they have their own leaders. So we can see that tribals are kind of disassociated with the folk culture. But at many times we also see the intermingling of the two, that we will discuss in the next topic. But before that, talking about the tribals only, we can see that in ancient history we do not have a very formal recognition to the tribal groups. So we do not easily classify that who exactly are the tribal groups. It is only after the constitution was framed that we see that under scheduled tribes we get a very formal recognition of who these tribal groups are. Now as we discuss, there is kind of an interconnection between the tribal and the folk traditions in India. Remember, tribal traditions are very specific to a geographical area where these people are living in some kind of a village and they have their own customs and their own rituals, whereas the folk traditions are more associated with the mainstream culture. But from time to time there is intermingling of them. How does this happen? First of all, there is exchange of deities and rituals. So some example of these include the example of the Jagannath cult in Odisha. In Puri in Odisha, we see that this particular deity was a tribal god who was worshipped there, but later on it became a mainstream phenomena, and this is how we can see there is exchange of deities between the folk and the tribal culture. Then adoption of Hindu epics. If you talk about Ramayana and Mahabharata, we see that if you talk to any person in any part of India, that person would be aware about the story of Ramayana and Mahabharata. And if you talk about the different tribal groups as well, they will claim that the characters of Ramayana and Mahabharata, Rama, Lakshmana and Mahabharata, if we talk about Pandavas, Draupadi, they all came and visited their villages, their forest land. So we can see that through these stories, through these epics, there is a kind of a connection between the folk and the tribal culture. Then sacred nature. If we talk about both the tribal and the folk culture, we can see there is evidence of worshipping nature. If you remember, in the early Vedic period, natural forces were worshipped, and even in tribal culture, because tribal people normally lived in forests, so they worshipped their nature a lot. They lived their life in harmony with nature, right? So that is another common trend between the two. And then shared beliefs in higher divinity. So the idea of a higher, of somebody being supreme than you, being higher than you in status, the idea of God is present in both folk and tribal culture. So in these examples we can see that even though there is a lot of variation in different schools of thought that exist in the Indian society, there is still a lot of commonalities which makes our Indian philosophy, yes, diverse, but also quite consistent, right? And that is why we say the culture roots of India, which we discuss overall through this chapter, are quite diverse and quite unique in itself, right? So thank you so much for watching this video lecture, and we will meet again in the next one.